welcome back. My name's Amelia Goerlitz. I'm the Fellowship and Academic Programs Coordinator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I want to second thanks to our wonderful speakers today and to all of you for coming. It's really touching to see so many people here at this symposium in honor of Cindy's scholarship. I also want to thank Karen Lemmey and Emily Shapiro and Elizabeth Christopher, who have all done tremendous jobs in putting together this symposium, and it's really been a pleasure to work with them. They've filled a very large gap in my professional life since the departure of Cynthia Mills. I would like to introduce our last set of three speakers. Miguel de Baca will be our first speaker. He's the Kenneth and Harl Montgomery Assistant Professor in the Humanities and Assistant Professor of Art History at Lake Forest College. He specializes in modern and contemporary American art history, and his work explores how memory is invoked through objects, architecture, and marked sites. De Baca earned his BA from Stanford University in 2002 and his PhD from Harvard University in 2009. His research has been supported by fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, Dumbarton Oaks, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where he was advised by the late Cynthia Mills. He contributed an essay to the catalog for Lisa Blass's Meet Me at the Mason-Dixon at Gettysburg College in honor of the sesquicentennial anniversary of the Civil War in 2011, and his essay on allusions to the theme of loss in the work of Jasper Johns and Ellsworth Kelly appeared in the journal Art in Print in 2014. De Baca's first book, Memory Work, Anne Truitt, and Sculpture, is forthcoming with the University of California Press in 2015. Our second speaker is James Meyer, Associate Curator of Modern Art at the National Gallery of Art and Adjunct Professor of Art History at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to joining the National Gallery, he was the Winship Distinguished Research Associate Professor of Art History at Emory University, where he taught contemporary art and critical theory from 1994 to 2010. He is author of Minimalism, Art and Polemics in the 1960s, published by Yale University Press, and the Phaedon Survey, Minimalism. His essays have appeared in such journals as October, Grey Room, and Art Forum, where he is contributing editor. At the National Gallery, he has organized solo shows of the artists Carrie James Marshall and Mel Bachner for the East Buildings in the Tower series, and he is currently preparing an exhibition on the history of the Dwan Gallery in Los Angeles and New York from 1959 to 1971 that will reopen the renovated East Building in fall of 2016. His lecture today is taken from his current book project, The Art of Return, on the meaning of the 60s in contemporary art and culture, which he is preparing for the University of Chicago Press, and is a project supported by fellowships at the Clark Art Institute and here at the Smithsonian during the tenure of Dr. Mills. And lastly, our third speaker, Lisa Saltzman, is Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Chair in the Humanities and Professor of History of Art at Bryn College, where she teaches courses on modern and contemporary art, chairs the department, and from 2003 to 2009 served as director of the Center for Visual Culture. Saltzman received her BA from Princeton in 1988 and her PhD from Harvard in 1994. She has received fellowships from the DAAD, the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study, the Clark Art Institute, and the Guggenheim Foundation. Saltzman is the author of two books, Ansem Kiefer and Art After Auschwitz, and Making Memory Matter, Strategies of Remembrance in Contemporary Art. Together with Eric Rosenberg, she co-edited the 2006 volume, Trauma and Visuality in Modernity. Her talk today comes from her latest book project on the afterlife of photography in contemporary culture, entitled Daguerreotypes, Fugitive Subjects, Contemporary Objects. It is forthcoming with the University of Chicago Press. Now please welcome our three speakers.
Before I begin, I'd like to add my voice to the chorus of thanks to Amelia and Emily for inviting me to participate in this symposium, and also to the Smithsonian American Art Museum for its ongoing vigorous support of scholarship on American art. I continue to believe in museums, as did Dr. Mills, to be the catalysts for great ideas. A wall for apricots. Mary Pinchot Meyer and Anne Truitt were two artists who became close friends in the vibrant liberal intellectual circuit present in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Meyer was a painter in a hard-edged, abstract style, epitomized by this painting, Half Light, found in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Truitt, the better known of these two, was a sculptor whose pared-down planks, plinths, and columns are recognized as pioneering movements into what would later become known as minimalism. And here I'm showing you 17th Summer, also in the SAM collection. In October 1964, Truitt was preparing for her debut international solo exhibition at the Minami Gallery, a preeminent dealer in Tokyo, Japan, where she lived between 1964 and 1967. 1 week before the opening, she received a phone call. The voice on the line reported that Meyer had been murdered in broad daylight while out for a walk along the C&O Canal towpath in the heart of Georgetown. There were two bloodless bullet holes, one in her head and one in her heart. She had been shot execution style at point-blank range. The murder remains, to this day, unsolved. This paper offers a reading of the two sculptures that Anne Truitt made in memory of Mary Meyer after she died. These two artworks share a single idiosyncratic title, A Wall for Apricots, a phrase referring to the memory of a parlor game the two artists played years earlier. The first Wall for Apricots was made in 1966 of welded slab aluminum painted with industrial marine coating. Truitt removed the title in the early 1970s, around the time of her first career retrospective at the Corcoran. Significantly, this is also the moment at which the artist, sensing that her aluminum Japanese-made sculptures did not fit within her overall aesthetic, destroyed the majority of this body of work, including the sculpture we see here. The second Wall for Apricots was made in 1968, after Truitt had arrived back in the United States and returned to working with wood painted with thinned washes of Liquitex acrylic, her preferred media. Truitt sanded back between layers to achieve the ambiguous, multifaceted, colorful surfaces that are now a hallmark of her practice. This sculpture takes the form of a column, which was Truitt's favored shape after 1967, and one that she deployed almost exclusively for the next 40 years. Looking carefully at the major shifts in the look and substance of her sculptures between 1966 and 1968, I wish to argue that by making these two works, which are ostensibly about the recognition of personal loss, Truitt was also redefining her art. As we begin, I think it is interesting to point out that the history of minimalism so often has been inflected by a curious amnesia. The absence of memory is enshrined in some of minimalism's canonical texts. Take, for instance, Frank Stella's emphatically present, "What you see is what you see," as soon as we get it there. Or Robert Morris's quotation in Notes on Sculpture of Tony Smith's plain assertion about the scale of his sculpture, "I was not making a monument." The banality of Robert Smithson's post-minimal work on monuments is similarly well known and studied. By contrast, memory is everywhere in Truitt's best-selling artist journals, Daybook, Turn, and Prospect. When we read these books, we see that Truitt's deployment of memory in her writing is remarkably heterogeneous. Memory appears as unpredictable, as revelatory, and as frustratingly indirect as what we perceive in our own natural experiences of recollection. We can, however, identify a conceptual origin for Truitt's memory work. The artist's interest in a theory of memory had begun in 1955 with her official translation of secondary literature on Marcel Proust's long novel In Search of Lost Time. This introduction to Proust inspired the artist's lifelong admiration of the French author, whose narratives describe encounters with everyday objects that cause the spontaneous release of powerfully emotional memories. Mary Meyer was Truett's companion on a crucial trip to New York City in 1961, in which they visited the American Abstract Expressionists and Imagists exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum. Together, they viewed and discussed artworks by Ad Reinhardt and Barnett Newman. Truett was felled by Newman's 1-6, a large blue canvas bisected by a painted-in white zip. Years later, the artist wrote about her reaction in Daybook. What did I know, I asked myself. What did I love? The fields and trees and fences and boards and lattices of my childhood rushed across my inner eye as if borne by a great strong wind. I saw them all, detail and panorama, and my feeling for them welled up to sweep me into the knowledge that I could make them. Upon returning to her studio in Washington, she constructed this work, First, which, as its title suggests, was the artist's first sculpture in a newly adopted language of geometric simplicity. First consists of 3 vertical white-painted pales, cut to resemble a picket fence, the kind of fence Truett remembered from her childhood on the eastern shore of Maryland, and the kind of fence enshrined as an image and a metaphor in American cultural memory. Now, Truett's response to Newman's painting is interesting to me as a Proustian reaction, but more revealingly as a formal one. First reveals both Truett's cited sculptural response to Newman's painting in particular, and to the practice of painting more generally. Compellingly in Daybook, Truett wrote of her desire to take the paintings off the wall and set them free. Here, a painting's flatness refers to a perceptual limitation that the artist challenged. Like a painting, a fence is precisely a delimited surface with a discrete front and back. However, First is also a structure unlike a painting, allowing the viewer to occupy one or both sides of the fence in circumnavigation. The viewer becomes acutely aware of the spatial dynamics that solicit her body into a relationship of inside and outside, recto and verso, inclusion and exclusion. However, Truett's art is not purely denotative, but instead a process of mediation between the object and the viewer. Our memory thickens. The object is a stimulus, but space provides a sensory context. Truett's ensuing practice was about these subtle meanings that break through ordinary perception, that demonstrate clearly a moment of perception that cannot be abstracted neither from its immediate context nor from its references to the past. The intuitively remembered meanings of a shape, a color, an armature are in fact the very substrate of perception itself. As she continued working in 1962 and 1963, Truett became ever more attentive to how her sculptures opened up such horizons of experience. After experimenting for some time with conventional bases for her planks and plinths, such as in these 2 sculptures, Southern Elegy and Hardcastle, she eventually exhibited works directly on the floor, one of only a handful of artists at the time doing so, as a way of announcing the sculpture's consistency with the viewer's zone of encounter. As the scale of these sculptures grew larger, Truett began to identify color as the formal property that her work singularly magnified in the viewer's visual plane. In fact, regarding this sculpture, Valley Forge, Truett spoke of colors that were cantilevered, at once grounded on the vertical axis and suspended on the horizontal one. Her deployment of an architectural vocabulary to describe color was consistent with what she called setting color free. But set free from what exactly? Color set free from the localizing impulse of the canvas. Color existing beyond the edge as immersive experience. As color was set free from a painted surface, it was also liberated from codes of traditionally painterly meaning, set adrift into space, quickening in the viewer's perceptive apparatus. In 1964, Anne Truitt's husband James accepted a position as the Asian bureau chief of Newsweek, headquartered in Tokyo, and the Truitts moved from Washington, D.C. to Japan. By the end of the 1970s, reflecting on her Japanese work, Truitt's chief complaint was that it seemed too intellectually driven, and it's true that there's kind of a plain formalism in her experiments from this time. Her main concern was to get the sculptural surface to understand how it could refer to space beyond the edge. Truitt marshaled the formal properties of shape to experiment with the differences between rational and anti-rational form. For instance, in one working drawing, the artist drew a grid with graphite pencil and then filled in a hump-shaped fragment of it with blue and red acrylic paint, as if looking through an irregular-shaped aperture, highlighting a specifically resonant section within a larger field of interest. Truitt tried to translate this idea into sculpture, as we see from this fabrication maquette from 1964. There we go, in which she stapled together 4 irregular quadrilateral shapes as the 4 sides of a proposed sculpture. The maquette bears a resemblance to the realized sculptures Out and Back, both dated 1964. Each face of the sculpture represents a fragment of unified space, an entire range of space unrestricted by the edge. When these 4 shapes come together in an enclosed volume, the resulting object is at once compact and expansive. I situate us once again on the eve of Truitt's exhibition of these sculptures at the Minami Gallery in October 1964. Truitt received word of Meyer's death, but decided to remain in Japan, knowing that she was soon to travel to the United States for her second solo show at the Andre Emmerich Gallery early in 1965. But after that exhibition, Truitt's anxieties compounded. Her work had not only been misunderstood by the Tokyo critics, but also received negatively in New York. She was especially upset by the critical consensus that her artworks appeared to be painted sculptures. I should say they are painted sculptures, but the idea that her sculptures were painted or arbitrarily painted or merely decorated with color ran counter to her serious investigation of the reaches between memory, surface, and space. Confronted by this criticism of her Japanese work, Truitt wrote to Emmerich that her first instinct was to make sculptures so gigantic that they would declare an entire environment. The viewer would have no choice but to encounter them spatially. She proposed a work to measure a gargantuan 30 by 50 by 150 feet. Modern sculpture at this scale was unprecedented in 1965. Ronald Bladen's work is roughly analogous, but even his seminal huge sculpture 3 Elements, also from 65, measures only 28 feet on its longest side. Truitt never realized these room-sized sculptures, but her imagination of a sculpture that envelops the viewer within its shadows indicates a new and profound contemplation of space. The 1966 Wall for Apricots demonstrates where Truitt arrived in her practice. It is a flat sheet of aluminum bent on a break, declaring a narrow interior semi-enclosure, standing flush on the ground without a supportive base. This small fold is not merely self-reflexive, but rather opens to the outside, to the world of the onlooking viewer. At the very same time, in works on paper, the artist explored interior versus exterior positioning through the familiar motif of fences. And in turn of these fences, I think we recognize the genetic moment of her Proustian recourse to the fields, trees, fences, boards, and lattices of her childhood in Maryland, a memory no doubt supplanted supplemented by the memory of her first beholding of Newman's painting Monument 6, which had occurred 3 years earlier in New York, a memory no doubt haunted by that of her companion and interlocutor, Mary Meyer. What is within our grasp to understand this sculpture as motivated by Truett's grief? I posit that an important part of achieving consolation is the mourner's acceptance of intermediating memories that not only create distance from the catastrophe of death, but also perform an assessment of the loss. Certainly, this was Proust's attitude to mourning in À la Recherche, In Search of Lost Time. I'm thinking here of the very long narrative of Marcel's grandmother's illness, death, and bereavement. In one of Proust's most famous passages entitled Intermittences of the Heart, a title, it must be said, the author considered for the entire work as a whole, it is not until a full year after the death that the narrator grasps and acknowledges his profound feelings of loss. As Proust's novel attests, the past folds itself into present perception in irregular patterns, and it is through this experience that human beings achieve critical agency. Specifically for Proust, this agency took the form of writing about the extraordinary sensations of memory, in short, sublimating his experiences of loss into art. Fabricated 2 years after Meyer's murder, A Wall for Apricots evidences a similar collision of memories that permitted Truett at last to affiliate Meyer with the origins of her minimal work and to further explore the relationship between her private work of mourning and the public space of its deployment. Truett made 12 of these folded sculptures, exhibiting but a single one of them only once in Tokyo in 1967. On the evidence, it appears that these works did not give the artist any lasting satisfaction in working her way out of the painted sculpture problem. But out of these folded sculptures, it became clear that she wanted to preserve an expansive sense of space without the enclosing gesture of the fold. Truett thus spent the rest of her time in Japan focusing on the spatial effects of color as achieved in works on paper, such as these small sheets of rice paper soaked in various colors of thinned pigment. The curved lines in the glazed papers realize tentative boundaries between soaked colors that seem to delimit their own space. Colors recede, they hover, they pull away. Truett began to see how she could apply this effect of color to geometric forms through sumi ink drawings, of which 15 are extant, all similar in composition, 2 perfectly straight side-by-side stripes of different values of gray, painted from edge to opposite edge on watercolor paper. When they were made in 1966, Truett signed the drawings horizontally. Later in 1967, after she returned to the United States, the artist re-signed the works vertically. This reorientation reveals that Truett was beginning to comprehend chromatic subtlety in the context of precise vertically rectangular shapes. And this is Return of 1967, which, as its title suggests, is the first sculpture Truett made after returning to the US from Japan. A slender wooden column painted on each of its faces with vertical stripes and barely offset shades of fuchsia. Its relationship to space is held in tension with our perception of its color, which solicits, even demands, our attention. We pause to ask whether the effects of value are a factor of the ambient light or of the color's internal luminosity. Truett's work awakens the knowledge that our eyes are connected to our bodies. In some cases, it is unclear whether we are looking at the sculpture face on or obliquely. Truett found a way of evoking such space through color, rather than literalizing space as in the interior angles of her folded work. The 1968 Wall for Apricots follows suit. It is a sparse but muscular column, which exemplifies the formal vocabulary she perfected after she returned to the US. It looks to me nothing like the earlier wall for apricots. These anomalous colors, grayish white, yellowish green, orangish yellow, strain against the crisp boundaries between them and against the sculptural edge. As a column, it necessarily involves a relationship to the viewer's natural body. As James Meyer observed in 2009, its segments pertain to the head, the torso, the legs. Thus, encountering this sculpture is not unlike seeing parts of ourselves in radically retrained vision. Significantly, this sculpture's effulgent surfaces also cultivate the beholder's critical acuity to hold each glance in the memory of the preceding one as she moves around it. And these immediately past sensations compete with the desire to know the whole form in the present moment of perceiving. Another difference is that Truett's work during and after 1968 marks unprecedented chromatic variation and intensity. After her return to the United States, she was emboldened to engage color as a subject in itself, to claim for it a special importance in her practice. Even though the viewer may feel an initial attachment to what a given color represents, upon further reflection, Truett's hard-to-name hues are fundamentally unstable, enlisting a range of transmutable meanings held in active tension. We see this not only in Return and Wall for Apricots, but also in, there's Return and Wall for Apricots, but also in Mourning Choice, Landfall, and Summer Dryad. Taken in concert with the impossibility of comprehending the physical form of the sculpture in a single glance, there is something deliberately fugitive in Truett's new work, something that seduces us into the storehouse of our own memories, but quickly resists assimilation therein. What I am suggesting, then, is that Truett's post-1968 sculptures present a condition of loss that delights in its own transience. The earlier 1966 sculpture, especially when taken together with the drawings of fences, provided a visual reference to the original spatialized memories that prompted the quantum leap in her practice in 1961. This hermetic gesture is not present in the later Wall for Apricots. In fact, I would argue that this new sculpture deliberately resists the consolidation of memory. Through color and space, a Wall for Apricots signifies a process of memory that is open-ended, never complete, but not melancholic. Melancholy pertains to an ongoing sense of grief and internalized emotional antagonism. To call upon Newman once more, perhaps it is melancholy that prevails over his one-ment, which so clearly pictorializes the violence of separation through its authoritative zip. Two halves left permanently to yearn for their other side. By contrast, Truett's sense of loss is less predictable, all the more subtle and iconoclastic. At last, and as I close, I am ready to discuss the bizarre title of this sculpture, which I have avoided until now because I did not want the arbitrariness of language to overshadow a discussion of Truett's important formal developments. In a recorded interview in the 1990s, Truett remembered that she and Mary Meyer were at a dinner party at which the host asked each of the guests to write down 3 things they loved and 3 things that they abhorred. It was kind of a conversation game. Truett remembered that Mary Meyer wrote down the things she loved as white walls and apricots, and what was the third? Truett said, "I have forgotten." The constructed inconclusiveness of Truett's recollection teaches us something about the fundamental nature of memory. It is conditional, partial, contingent, interest-driven, and with our interests, it changes. The poignancy of what we remember about all of our lost others derives from its discrimination, from its obdurate refusal to reveal. And in truth, it is this quality of memory that motivates expression. For indeed, when we stand authentically in one's presence, no name, no picture is needed. Thank you.
I too want to thank Amelia and Emily for including me, and to say how grateful I am to Cynthia, who encouraged me to apply for the grant that I ended up accepting and coming here, allowing me a year to think through the ideas that are developing into this book, The Art of Return, the 60s and Contemporary Art and Culture. And Cynthia had said how much she looked forward to reading my book. Well, she's not going to read my book, but I look forward to reading hers. And I'm also delighted to be in a session with Miguel de Baca and Lisa Saltzman. So the title of this talk is Against Nostalgia, Carrie James Marshall and the 60s. What can one period mean to another? In Farewell to an Idea, T.J. Clark observes that modernism is our antiquity. Modernism, as conceived by Clark, is both an historical epoch and an idea, the idea that we can prove the present and invent the future. Modernism is thus a belief in the ability of human beings to invent new forms, the fantasy that we can be new. It is this idea, a driving force of art from David to Pollock, to which Clark bids farewell. But if modernism is our antiquity, as Clark claims, what is our modernism? The era we call the 60s, a period that arguably stretches within the American context from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, from Rosa Parks's refusal to cede her bus seat to the fall of Saigon. This long 60s is at once the last moment of modernism and the beginning of the contemporary, the time that is no longer modern. The 60s is thus the memory of modernism, the last moment when it was still possible to imagine that one could be new. And so the 60s exerts a grip on our imagination. The 60s is a central topos of the contemporary. And as the historical 60s recedes into history, another 60s, I would argue, has taken its place, a 60s that invites memory and nostalgia. This distinction between the historical 60s and what I call a 60s return is crucial. How do we describe this reverberation of one period on another? What is the nature of this return? In 1998, the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago presented Carrie James Marshall's landmark installation, Mementos. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a sequence of 4 large canvases affixed directly to the wall with grommets. Marshall called the series Souvenirs. An African-American angel, her wings studded with gold glitter, welcomes a beholder. The room in which she stands is ordinary, its furniture and decor distinctly middle class. 2 flower-filled vases rest on a marble tabletop supported by clawed feet. A wall hanging inset in a cloud evokes those memorial banners that were often seen in black households in the period following the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy in 1968. Like these banners, Marshall's depicted banner presents 3 martyrs of the civil rights era, Dr. King and the 2 Kennedy brothers, with the dates of their births and deaths. Below the caption, "We mourn our loss," appears in the Gothic typography of the Black church. The photo, silkscreen faces of other movement martyrs float above in another cloud spackled in glitter. Arranged from left to right, in the order of their deaths, are the activist Medgar Evers, see on the far left, who was shot dead in his driveway in Jackson by the Klansman Byron Della Beckwith in '63. The 4 girls killed in the notorious bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that year. The voting rights volunteers Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, murdered during the Mississippi summer of '64. Malcolm X, assassinated in '65, and Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, the Black Panthers who met the same fate during the illegal raid of Hampton's apartment by the Chicago police in '69. So there you see the 3 civil rights workers, some detail of them. The legend in memory of, spelled in the cursive script and glitter of a sympathy card, and gold garlands festooned the cloud of angel martyrs. The space of Souvenir 1 is both shallow and illusionistic. The green walls and carpet with a pattern of red garlands recede orthogonally behind a proscenium of gold tassels. Marshall sets up the fiction of those Flemish Annunciation scenes, such as the Merode altar, that one has entered a sacred space, a space that is both ordinary and extraordinary, a place where angels and clouds of smoke appear suddenly, momentously, overwhelming the mortal beholder, and even tables and vases are iconographically momentous. His angel beckons a viewer to join her. What is the purpose of her behest, her invitation? The woman in black is an angel of memory. Marshall has observed, she, quote, asks us to remember all the people who are represented there. Souvenir, from the Latin subvenire, means to call to mind, to remember. A souvenir is a token of memory, a memento, quote, a reminder of what is past or gone. All of the works in the Renaissance Society show were mementos, invitations to remember. In Souvenir 2, an angel in a blue skirt and heels carries a vase into a beige parlor. A horizontal banner of Dr. King and the Kennedys is framed by 2 new faces. They are Viola Luzzo and Jimmy Lee Jackson. Less well-known martyrs of the movement, who were both murdered by the Klan during the unrest in Montgomery in 1965, were asked to remember them too. In Souvenir 3 and 4, painted in the grisaille palette of 60s newspapers and television reports, Marshall enlarges the optic of memory again. We're asked to identify more and more faces and names. Souvenir 3 is an elegy to notable African-American writers, artists, and performers who died during the 60s. Many of whom, of course, we associate with the Harlem Renaissance and with modernism in this country. And he paints the year of their death beneath each name. The angel at left has silver glitter wings, and here too the legend in memory of is covered in glitter. And in Souvenir 4, we have an homage to the great blues and jazz musicians who died during this period. African sculptures recall the African heritage of these musical traditions. Oversized wood and metal stamp sculptures arranged at the entrance to the Renaissance Society presented such famous maxims of the period as Black Power, by any means necessary, and we shall overcome, etched in reverse. The printed versions of these texts in the tricolor hues of the Black nationalist flag hung on a wall above a tricolor carpet evoking the flag of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by Marcus Garvey in 1920, a movement that anticipated the Black nationalist politics of the 60s and 70s. And on a nearby wall, a plastic sculpture recalled the sign of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. A large bouquet of wax flowers jutted out from the top, a funereal bouquet for the 4 girls murdered during the bombing. Remember, these angels instruct. Cicerones of memory, they ask us to recall the dead. This invitation is the exhibition's first mode of address, its stated or denotated content. But then Marshall distances us from this mnemonic demand, this call to mourning. He inscribes in these works a connotative or second degree of meaning, a signifier of a signifier, which is how the critic Roland Barthes describes connotation. These works not only beseech us to remember, they cause us to reflect on the very nature of 60s memory. What are we asked to remember exactly? To whom are these paintings addressed? In other words, who is being asked to remember? What purpose will memory serve? If we remembered all these names and faces and dates, what good would it do? What is more, what are the costs of memory? When is memory too much? When does it become what Nietzsche, in his essay, The Uses and Abuses of History, refers to as the chain of memory, memory as burden, as weight? Marshall has transformed these ordinary interiors into memorials. The middle-class black living room is a funeral parlor. Memory in these works is accretive, additive, nominative. It is, above all, endless. With each new painting, we're asked to identify more and more faces and names. In Souvenir 2, the addition of Luzo and Jackson's portraits ensures that 2 more martyrs will not, at least for now, be forgotten. In Souvenir 3, names alone are offered as triggers of memory, as souvenirs. And indeed, the later works in the series complicate the very process of naming and remembering. In Souvenir 4, the silk-screened faces of musicians call out the names of lesser-known figures. The remembered remember. The dead recall the dead. A scroll bearing still other names devoid of faces unfurls into the wood-paneled room, where the angels in the first 3 souvenir pictures stand in front, welcoming a spectator to step inside. The angel in Souvenir 4 is remote, her gaze distant. She sits rather than stands. Her wings, painted the same value of gray as the sofa, blend into the scene, weighed down by all the names and faces that surround her, and all the names etched into the memory scroll. This angel of 60s memory has grown weary of her burden. When indeed is memory too much? Yet another work in the Renaissance Society presentation, a photograph, depicts a mirror stuffed with pictures and newspaper clippings of 60s martyrs. These prints are the source material for the silkscreen portraits in the pictures, in the paintings. In this image, an ordinary mirror, illuminated by a golden light bulb, is transformed into a shrine. The artist's studio is a site of memory. Another tilted mirror, etched in a floral pattern evocative of the garlands and souvenirs, partially discloses the reflection of Marshall himself as he photographs the mirror altar. The large mirror pitched against the wall evokes the memory of 60s martyrs, of King, the Kennedys, and so on. The smaller mirror, we could say, is a meta-reflection, literally. Marshall pictures himself remembering the 60s. I attempt to remember the 60s, he seems to say, then I picture myself in this act. Note that his body is occluded, his face nearly hidden. The 60s martyrs are more visible, more present to us than Marshall himself, the artist who remembers them. Marshall describes works like the souvenirs as history paintings. Yet they're not history paintings in the classical sense. In the academic tradition of that genre, favored the depiction of heroic human actions as Aristotle describes in the Poetics. The representation of history in the classical image involved a condensation of complex events into a single scene, a pregnant moment, as it was called, that a viewer could grasp. The artist of classical representation depicted a discrete moment in time, a past that is over. In the art of Kerry James Marshall, the past is never truly past. History returns unbidden and often unconsciously in the minds of the living. For Black Americans, the founding episode of African American identity, the Middle Passage of slave ships, is both historical and mnemonic, a past so remote as to be unknowable to us now, yet a past that still impacts the contemporary, that returns, the memory of a trauma. This blurring of history and memory was the central concern of the exhibit we installed at the National Gallery last year. In Marshall's painting, Great America, the centerpiece of the show, a tunnel of love boat ride in a contemporary amusement park triggers the distant memory of the Middle Passage, of bodies thrown overboard due to disease and starvation, suggested by the Yoruban voodoo imagery on the boat and the bobbing head of a man overboard. For African Americans, there is no escaping this history, even as more and more Black people move into the middle-class suburb, a world of swimming pools and white picket fences. The swimmer in plunge prepares to dive into a pool containing voodoo symbols, a toy ship, and a compass. The pool itself is a miniature Atlantic, the outlines of a swimmer's arm and head referencing Cuba and Jamaica, two centers of the triangle slave trade. So this is what we tried to evoke, sort of between these three incredible pictures. The Corcoran painting, now entering the National Gallery, Voyager, kind of direct depiction, if you will, although indirect in many ways, of the Middle Passage. Great America, the amusement park scene set in a kind of vague contemporary, and then Plunge. Now, the 60s is a fairly recent past, a past that's not entirely past, depending on one's age and point of view. The Mementos show marked the 60s as history. The clipped haircuts of the Kennedys and Dr. King and the bobbed hair of the schoolgirls locate these figures indisputably in that time. In Souvenir 2, the digital telephone, a technology that did not exist during the 60s, and a pile of phone books bearing the logo of Ameritech, a company incorporated during the 80s, situates those living rooms squarely in the 90s. And what is more, dates those paintings. In the age of the cell phone and internet, the landline and phone book are increasingly outmoded. Something interesting is how these paintings have already aged. So there's that wonderfully already dated phone and the big phone books. These works stress the distance between 68 and 1998. They imply that the 60s is over. But then Marshall fills these interiors with these ghostly apparitions, these endless names, lists of names and dates. He paints a 60s that enshrouds the present in a haze of mourning and memory, a 60s that refuses to go away. Why does the 60s remain such a preoccupation of contemporary art and art history? The writings of the German historian Reinhard Koselleck are a useful guide here. What I'm calling the 60s return is what Koselleck once called a future past, the mnemonic reverberation of one time on another. There is the historical 60s, the 60s that came to an end, and there is the 60s that comes after the 60s, that returns. There is no one continuous historical time, says Koselleck, only times in the plural. Each period has a temporal rhythm, a post-history. It becomes meaningful at a later date. Time for Reinhard Koselleck is not a static periodicity, a closed temporal span, a past that is past, that was as it was, as the positivist historian would have us believe. Time for the author of Futures Past is dynamic, temporalized, and what is more, proleptic. A period anticipates its return, its recollection. A future past is the hermeneutical future of a time, the meaning of one era for another. What is the future of the 60s as opposed to other times? Koselleck singles out revolutionary moments, such as 1789, 1848, and 1917, as times that exert a particular force, and I quote, "The more a particular time is experienced as new, as modernity, the more its demands of the future increase. The revolutionary time unleashes a hypertrophy, an excess of memory, as subsequent generations come to terms with what happened. Now, the 60s, I claimed earlier, has come to represent a last moment of modernity, of utopic imagination, a last moment, in the words of the critic Frederick Jameson, when it, quote, seemed for a while as if everything was possible. Its mnemonic demands are thus extreme. The 60s is monumental history in Nietzsche's sense, a time of grand gestures, of heroic oratory, a time we wish we could emulate, if only we could be as heroic as Dr. King or Viola Luso. The monumental 60s is the 60s Marshall's angels mourn, and that they invite us to remember. Let us turn to another writer on memory, Pierre Nora. In his well-known article, Between Memory and History, Les lieux de mémoire, Nora makes a key distinction between lieux, or places of memory, and milieu, or communities of memory. For Nora, the place of memory, the lieu de mémoire, is a site of official memory. Here is memory sequestered in a memorial, removed from daily life, petrified. Memory as obligation, or duty memory, as Nora calls it. We've looked at a lot of those, I think, lieux de mémoire in today's session. A milieu, or community of memory, according to Nora, is a context of living memory, memory that is embedded in and that serves daily life, such as the oral traditions handed down in rural villages in France. This sort of memory flourishes in closed communities, and Nora is nostalgic for these pre-industrial milieux. With urbanization, communities fracture, there is less and less memory. Memory becomes archival, historical, official. History triumphs over it. Duty memory, the memory of the lieu, trumps living memory, the memory of the milieu. So the Mementos installation of Marshall explores the ambivalent character of 60s memory, and of African American memory in particular after the 60s. His work triggers a longing for a time imagined to have been more monumental than our own. Yet his works reflect on the costs of always gazing backwards to an imagined golden age, next to which the present is felt to be inferior and small. The civil rights period is a monumental era of Black history and memory, marked this past year by the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And so the 60s risks becoming a burden to those who are constantly reminded to remember. Marshall's angels elucidate duty memory, memory that transforms daily life into an endless cycle of mourning. The rhetoric of the 60s, the art historian Rick Powell has written of these paintings, quote, places African Americans in the dual roles of pallbearer and the deceased, grieving for a vocal, powerful, long-departed Black self. The Mementos installation elicit nostalgia for the 60s, yet they're critical of nostalgia, or anti-nostalgic. I use the word nostalgia deliberately. Nostalgia, in the modern sense of the term, means a longing for childhood, for the time of earliest memory, and it's not for nothing that Marshall paints the 60s and its return. For Marshall was himself a child then. Born in Birmingham in 55, he moved with his family to LA in 63, the subject of his eponymous painting Watts, 1963, one of a series of works depicting public housing projects built during that period, where we see the artist's brother, sister, and Marshall himself as children newly arrived in Southern California, the land of, quote, more of everything. There he witnessed the Watts riot in '65 at the age of 10, and grew up only a few blocks from the LA headquarters of the Black Panthers, whose impassioned speeches he still recalls. In the work of Marshall and in other artists who interest me, like Sam Durant and Renee Green and Felix Gamelin and Tacita Dean, whose earliest memories are of that period, the 60s is depicted not as a golden or monumental age one has missed, but as an historical era, seen without the rose-tinted lenses of nostalgia. In another important study of memory entitled Present Past, the literary critic Richard Turdeman argues along the same lines as Reinhard Koselleck that a crisis of memory may be seen in the French literature of the mid-19th century, in the work of such authors as Alfred de Musset, who were born in the period after the French Revolution. Like Musset and other artists born during the aftermath of revolutionary moments, the generation of the 60s or early 70s, the late or post-boomers that I refer to in my study as 60s children, are compelled to remember and to understand, in the words of the artist Renee Green, those currents that affected them before they were consciously aware of their capacity to shape. And yet the memory of the 60s is indeed a burden. When memory is too much, Nietzsche advises us, it's necessary to forget. Marshall's Souvenirs works suggest the costs of nostalgia, the need to forget in order to move forward. And the final work at the Renaissance Society was a tomb-like structure called Laid to Rest. We look through the peepholes of ersatz stone walls, and on the other side of the wall we spy a wooden coffin adorned with wax flowers. A doll with racist features lies within. A video entitled Laid to Rest projects above the coffin, and we see images of children caught in the crossfire of teenage shooters, and we hear the sound of gunshots. Pennies bearing the image of the emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, a figure of black mourning during Reconstruction, float among the children's faces. We're invited to grieve not for the famous figures of the civil rights era, but for the anonymous child victims of neighborhood shootings. An epidemic that continues to this day in South Chicago, the neighborhood where Marshall lives and works. Marshall catapults the spectator into the present. The contemporary, he implies, is the time that we're in. The time explored and laid to rest is the present. For now, young African-American children, the dreams of full racial and economic equality of the 60s have still to be fulfilled. Let me conclude with one last work. Marcia completed Memento 5, a coda to the Souvenirs, in 2003. Here is another angel. The space she inhabits is shallower than in the Souvenirs. A beholder is shut out by the silver glitter stripes of a vertical window shade. Here the portraits of Dr. King, the Kennedys, and Malcolm are partially hidden. There are no more names and dates of birth and death, only the years of the decadal 60s. You see, where did they go? Oh, there they are. Placed in chronological order on their sides. Why did Marshall take up this subject 5 years after the Mementos show? The work was inspired, he has said, by the sentencing of Byron de la Beckwith, with the murder of Medgar Evers in that very year, 40 years after the heinous crime. What a time, the legend reads. With the Klansmen brought to the justice, the 60s returns for another time. The historical 60s are over. The 60s return is drawing to a close. The curtains are shut, the angel retreats. We are no longer asked to remember. Thank you.
I want to echo my fellow panelists' thanks to Amelia and to Emily, and make clear that I'm particularly grateful to have been included in today's proceedings, given that, unlike my fellow panelists, I did not have the pleasure of working with or knowing the scholar, editor, and mentor in whose honor today's symposium was organized. Let me begin with two photographs, each exemplary of the series of which it is part. In the first, on your left, we glimpse tanks, infantry platoons, and commanding officers deployed across an arid landscape of desert and mountain. Responsive to the ethical and aesthetic legacies of war photography, the images in the first series ground their depiction of military operations in the visual strategies of prior centuries and conflicts. Shot with a descendant of the British folding field camera and realized as a set of silver gelatin prints, the photographs are unabashedly documentary in style. But even as the camera and the prints maintain a link with earlier prototypes and processes, their iconography signals their distance from earlier eras. Indeed, these photographs reveal neither this republic of suffering, to refer again to Drew Faust, that was America during and after the Civil War, nor do they expose, with all the immediacy of fast film and handheld camera, the devastation wrought by later 20th century geopolitical conflicts. Instead, shot from a safe distance with a tripod-mounted camera, these photographs document something of the current practices of war, presenting a catalog of modern military maneuvers from troop movements and mechanized assaults to security and stabilization operations. In the second photograph on your right, a different photographic history is invoked. Devoid of human presence, the pictures present vistas of classical temples and sanctuaries, arches and porticos, stoas and atria, all bathed in the soft light of either dusk or dawn. Evocative of the 19th century practice of documenting architectural patrimony, the photographs are also inflected by the aesthetic impulses of the subsequent century. Indeed, it is as if a melancholy heir to Eugène Auger had sought to counter the surrealism of Giorgio de Chirico's painted piazzas with all the evidentiary force of the mechanically produced image. Shot with a digital camera and printed as a set of pigmented inkjet images, the archaeological artifacts of the ancient world are brought forth with entirely digital means. In these photographs that preserve no vestige of the analog processes that once grounded the medium, it is the relics of a distant place and time that are made visible. While each set of black and white photographs evinces something of a documentary aesthetic, neither is in any conventional sense of the term an exemplar of that genre. For all the veracity of the images, what the camera witnesses are neither combat situations nor classical ruins, but instead their simulation. In each instance, the camera turns its unflinching eye on proxies and substitutes, capturing and recording narrative and pictorial fictions. Visual records of simulations, these two contemporary photographic series immerse us in a reality structured by the logic of imposture. As photographs of fictions, these two series, On Millet's 29 Palms and Gregory Crewdson's Sanctuary, draw us into the fictions of photography. Turning first to Ley, what does it mean to shoot war photographs that are and aren't war photographs? Exiled as a schoolchild from Vietnam, Ley completed her education at Stanford and Yale, first in biology, then in art, and returned to her homeland shortly thereafter to make her series of photographs, Vietnam. Images only of aftermath, the war-torn landscape of her disrupted childhood remained largely invisible beneath signs of post-war industrial development and consumer culture. It was only in her subsequent series of photographs, Small Wars, that war and war photography became a more manifest subject and recognizable genre. But even here, Ley's war pictures were not exactly emblems of the genre. For even as she studiously recapitulated the aesthetic standards of documentary photography and combat photojournalism, embedding with her subjects and shooting and developing irrefutably evidentiary images, her exercises in reportage remain records of pure fiction. Whether of encampments, hand-to-hand combat, or distant encounters, her lens captured not scenes of actual battle, but instead its belated restaging by reenactors. Small Wars documents the activities of a group of men who spend their weekends reenacting the Vietnam War in the forests of Virginia. Aspiring to historical accuracy with detailed props, uniforms, and battle plans, the men sustain the illusion of fighting the Vietnam War, even as the southern landscape bears little resemblance to that of Southeast Asia. Played out far from Vietnam, but quite close to the Maya Lin Monument that commemorates its toll on American forces, the war games transform the countryside that once served as battleground for the American Civil War as only theater can. Elaborate versions of the games children play as they imaginatively inhabit the roles of soldiers. Their dramas also refract the practice of the popular historical reenactments that continue to rehearse the defining and divisive national conflict of the Civil War. Using a technique that blends the ethical imperatives of photojournalism with the aesthetic values of straight art photography, particularly in relation to the landscape, Ley adopts these photographic conventions and genres to uncover and record the forms that the historical imagination takes. Whatever the tenuous relation to reality of the action before her lens, hers is an investigative project. Ley has no direct hand in the events that unfold. Instead, she enjoys the peculiar privilege of bearing witness to full-scale, live-action dramas of historical reenactment and documenting them as something like reality. In many respects, her project is more deconstructive than documentary, managing to find in the recesses of American culture what her predecessors and peers have been creating in the studio or staging in the landscape, be it with toy soldiers and miniature tanks or actors and equipment. Ley's work distinguishes itself by achieving its authenticity through its particular relation to artifice. As such, her project offers a response within the medium of photography itself to the belated revelation and decades-long suspicion of the fabrications and deceptions involved in Robert Capa's iconic 1936 photograph from the Spanish Civil War, distilling the attendant ethical and historical issues in her own more detached documents of fictions. If in her actual Vietnam photographs she was too late to record anything but the post-war transformations of her childhood homeland, in Small Wars, something of that time and place can be seen again and anew in the forests of Virginia. There, Ley was granted permission to watch, photograph, and in some instances participate in the theatrical performance of the military operations that devastated the nation of her birth and forced her family into exile as refugees. And yet what she sees in surrogate exists only as sedimentation, reenactments of reenactments. Performed not only by Vietnam veterans, but by history buffs, the war games that Ley photographs are fictions of fictions, their action as inflected by television and film, as informed by experience. For not only was Vietnam America's first televised war, it also catalyzed the almost immediate and ongoing production of Hollywood films. With 29 Palms, the fictions are different. No longer structured by the retrospective temporality of reenactment, the photographs taken at 29 Palms bear witness to the preparations for an anticipated future. Inverting the logic of Small Wars, but still maintaining the uneasy relation between simulated and lived experience, in 29 Palms, Ley photographs not reenactments, but rehearsals, the training exercises of soldiers scheduled to deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan. In 29 Palms, the desert landscape of Southern California functions as the anticipatory double of the terrain the soldiers will soon occupy. The war games they play out are all too real, and yet not real enough. Scenarios scripted and performed as a means of preparation for the inevitable but unpredictable experience of combat that each soldier will face in the actual theater of war. Exercises in advance of actual combat, with some soldiers cast in the role of the Marines they are training to be, others cast as the insurgents they may soon encounter, the rehearsals also stand in as a proxy for what Ley cannot otherwise see. For Ley, the camera is as much a pretext to learn about the military and its preparations for war as it is an evidentiary tool. Denied her initial request to embed with the military overseas, but ultimately allowed access instead to a military training facility in the California desert, Ley is there able to witness something like war. Much as her sessions with the Vietnam War reenactors afforded her a retrospective glimpse of the American war that she experienced, but as a child did not fully witness or understand, her access to the Marine training facility allows her to see something like the present, if not also the future. If Ley's images complicate the project of investigative and documentary photography, they also produce a complex experience of temporality, one that unmoors the logic of return, so characteristic of the traumatic. To the extent that her photographs capture an uncanny double of the real, that is, in this instance, not the belated repetition that is reenactment, but the anticipatory repetition that is rehearsal, she shifts the experience of the traumatic into a register that is not retrospective, but prospective. But at the same time that her pictures extend into the future, they also return us to the past, a past that is not only historic, but cinematic. As Ley starts to watch the military exercises she will soon document, she exclaims, "This is just like Apocalypse Now." And in that moment of recognition, the Marine training facility at Joshua Tree National Park becomes one big stage set. It is no longer 29 Palms, nor is it Baghdad, nor Basra, Kabul, nor Kandahar. For all the disjunction of its dry and dusty landscape, from the forests and rice paddies of Southeast Asia, it is Vietnam, but Vietnam only as imagined in the work of Francis Ford Coppola and Marlon Brando, a cinematic invention animated as much by the residual literary trace of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as it was by the documented experiences of American soldiers. In that compressed moment of misrecognition, the desert that is 29 Palms recedes into and reemerges as Coppola's cinematic vision of the American war in Southeast Asia. And it is that cinematic frame that inflects Ley's experience of witness as she watches the military exercises underway in a surrogate desert on the outskirts of Los Angeles, only a few hours' drive from that locus of the cinematic imagination, Hollywood. But of course, Hollywood is not the only dream factory. It was Berlin's Babelsberg that inspired the phrase, and it was, among other studios, Rome's Cinecittà that helped to produce those wartime illusions. Striking, then, that it is at Cinecittà that Gregory Crutzen shoots his series, Sanctuary. A photographer whose principal body of work draws extensively from the codes of Hollywood cinema, Crutzen emerged from the MFA program at Yale to produce a set of hyperrealist landscapes that echo the establishing shots of David Lynch's suburban surrealist drama, Blue Velvet, and anticipate the iconography more fully elaborated in the fantastical natural histories of the contemporary painter Alexis Rockman. With his subsequent series, Twilight and Beneath the Roses, Crutzen opened his work to the human subject and more explicitly embraced the conceptual concerns of performance-driven photography. In that work, Crutzen recapitulated the premise of Cindy Sherman's film stills, but traded her deliberately amateurish aesthetic and emergent feminist investment in the visual iterations of identity for the high production values of Jeff Wall's monumental compositions, assimilating the fuller mise-en-scène and editing characteristic of Wall's cinematographic work, minus the vibrancy of Wall's signature lightbox transparencies or his investment in the inheritance of a canonical art history that strengthens their elusive armature. The product of intensive on-location shoots, each scouted, scripted, directed, and realized with the help of cameramen and extensive crew, the resulting photographs are expressly dramatic, characterized not only by their saturated color and chiaroscuro lighting, but also by the striking poses of their actors, each intensely absorbed in a role that, for all its implication of narrative, extends no further than the framing edge of the photograph. Languishing post-industrial cities in western Massachusetts provide a recognizable, yet ultimately generic site for Crewdson's signature photographic series. But whatever the actual backdrop, it is the aura of cinematic scenarios that provides their common surround. Whether standing rigid in a beam of extraterrestrial light in an otherwise deserted residential street, or posing stark naked amidst the mismatched furniture of a domestic interior, his actors seem to hover in an inchoate space of film scenes past, suspended in a time and place that is entirely invented, yet somehow utterly familiar. Ophelia may be the product of the literary imagination, but when she is depicted by Crewdson in his Twilight series, drowning in the rising waters of a dreary suburban living room, the image seems more attuned to Todd Solond's dystopian Welcome to the Dollhouse, as filtered through Ethan Hawke's slacker Hamlet, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Douglas Sirk's All That Heaven Allows, than it does to Shakespearean drama, or, for that matter, even the most fully realized tableau of Julia Margaret Cameron, Oscar Raylander, or Henry Peach Robinson. Melodramatic moments in the absence of sustaining narrative, Crewdson's photographs nevertheless distill something of the cultural inheritance of the cinema, if only by way of the mimicry of its codes. Their cinematic aura is then intensified through the sleight of hand that is post-production editing and digital manipulation. Unlike the photomontages of the Weimar or Soviet era, with their clearly composite, fragmentary syntax, the photo constructions of Crewdson and his contemporaries bear no visual evidence of their reworking. Masking their methods of montage and dissimulating their staging, these seamless illusions depict not perfect moments, but filmic fantasies. Notably, in Sanctuary, Crewdson employs a different set of methods than he did in his earlier series of photographs, forsaking his Hasselblad and most of his crew to shoot not what he scripts and stages, but simply what he finds. And not surprisingly, what he finds roaming Cinecittà are not the actual antiquities of Rome, Pompeii, or Herculaneum, but instead their cinematic doubles. At Cinecittà, Crewdson discovers and shoots abandoned movie sets, period. In that city of cinema, he finds nothing but forsaken illusions. Much as it takes some time to realize in the case of Lay's Small Wars or 29 Palms that hers are not pictures of actual wars, so too does Crewdson's Sanctuary initially fool its viewers into mistaking its subject for actual ruins. It is only upon closer inspection that certain details challenge the authority of the image and undermine the authenticity of the subject before the lens. That there are weeds or bits of trash amidst the ruins is hardly evidence of their fictive status. These details are but one more sign of overall neglect, easily assimilated into a coherent pictorial unity. The truth status of Sanctuary turns then not on signs of neglect, but on what we might reasonably assume are signs of attention, namely the presence of scaffolding. But much as we might briefly sustain the belief that the scaffolding girds a project of historic preservation, it is instead a literal prop, the armature that supports the illusionistic facades. In that movement from misrecognition to recognition, it becomes clear that the photographs bear witness not to ancient ruins, but instead to a rather derelict stucco and plywood set. And the scaffolding is not the only incriminating evidence of the imposture that the photographs ultimately reveal. In certain images, the camera forsakes the tight enclosure of street or atrium and pans up and out to include the horizon. There, it captures Rome's dismal post-war housing projects, their silhouettes delineating the city's periphery and anchoring the photographs to their time and place. In the end, whatever the detail, there is an aspect to every picture that disturbs the illusion of antiquity, something that reveals that Crewdson is not shooting in the Roman Forum, but instead in its languishing architectural simulacrum in an idle zone of Cinecittà. Where Jean-Luc Godard's Contempt took its viewers from Cinecittà to Capri, where the Casa Malaparte served as the modernist architectural backdrop for the restaging of classical antiquity in the form of a film shoot, with Fritz Lang directing a version of Homer's Odyssey, Crewdson's Sanctuary forgoes such narrative devices and captures only aging illusions of architectural antiquity, movie sets backed by the distant vista of modern architecture. As if to echo the diminished state of the stage sets themselves, the modernist backdrop to these classical fictions is not the glorious severity of Casa Malaparte's rationalist classicism, but aging post-war housing projects, their dilapidated silhouettes a sad emblem of architectural modernism's failed utopian aspirations. Whereas Crewdson's prior series capture the arrested moments in fabricated melodramatic scenes staged on simulated film shoots, Sanctuary shifts the terms of his relation to cinema, recording the relics and ruins of cinema's own history of visual fictions, as emblematized in the movie set, that object that is variously painterly, sculptural, and architectural. Much as Lay discovered situations in the world that muddy the distinctions between photographic genres and objectives and blur the boundaries between reality and fiction, Crewdson found built environments on the backlot that not only complicate the veridical function of the photograph, but implicate painting, sculpture, and architecture in that deconstructive project. All of which is to say, although in Sanctuary, Crewdson made an aspect of cinema and its illusory world his explicit subject, shooting as he did the derelict remains of movie sets, it may in fact be his least cinematic project. For in Sanctuary, Crewdson came face to face with a very different order of simulated worlds. Indeed, on the backlots of Cinecittà, Crewdson found and photographed something like what his predecessors and contemporaries, foremost among them James Casimir and Thomas Desmond, had been building in their studios. Casimir, for years, namely, models to serve as the surrogate subject for their photographs. So how do we approach what might be understood as a new form of pictorialism in the present, a moment when photography unabashedly relies upon practices of staging, manipulation, and fabrication to create its monumental visual spectacles? Just what is at stake when photography relinquishes what we once took to be its constitutive relation to the real and embraces the possibility of fiction? To think through these questions, I want to turn to another set of contemporary photographs, works that assert a very different relation to truth and fiction, history and its representation, landscape and its markers, straight photographic images of sites that are considered haunted by their pasts. On your left, an image from Sally Mann's series Motherland, a set of sepia-tone photographs shot in Virginia and Georgia in self-conscious relation to a trove of found Civil War photographs. And on your right, Ori Gerst's Unknown Land, chromogenic prints from his Liquidation series, shot neither in his native Tel Aviv nor the London of his present, but in the Ukrainian forests of his immediate ancestors. Yet for all the historical resonance of their locations, what do the photographs show? Nothing, or nothing more than the forests and trees, fields and streams of the American South and Eastern Europe. Whatever atrocities once defiled these sites remain beyond the reach of the lens. Whatever events once defined these places, and whatever traces of them once marked these locations, are now wholly invisible in the hazy, mist-shrouded atmospheric evocations of bucolic landscapes. If the photographs do bear witness, they bear witness only to the condition of having come too late, the landscapes arrested in a state of perpetual present, interrupted by neither monuments nor memorials, revealing neither gravestones nor tombs, displaying not a trace of visible evidence. These landscapes, laden with historical significance, have given way to sites of oblivion. Or have they? Let's turn for a moment from photography to painting. The painting, Poussin's, depicts an anonymous grave in a landscape, surrounded by a group of figures clad in the garb of classical antiquity. Shepherds, they cluster together, allied in their attempt to read the faint epitaph chiseled on the surface of the sepulchre. The second and final version of the painting, as we know from Panofsky's magisterial, if not definitive reading, it forgoes the admonishing morality and linguistic precision of its pictorial antecedents to depict the classical scene of encounter between shepherds and tomb as one of contemplative absorption. In its return to Virgil's utopian vision of Arcadia, the painting evokes not the dread of discovering death in the fullness of life, but rather nostalgia for the bliss of a lost pastoral idyll. For Panofsky, in the place of an anxious reminder of mortality, even in Arcadia, there am I, Poussin's work puts forth a willful, wistful stretching of the Latin syntax. I, too, lived in Arcadia. In Panofsky's interpretation of what is in the end an act of interpretation, of reading, menace gives way to remembrance, and something of Virgil's elegiac tradition is at once restored and born anew. Et in Arcadia ego, and in Arcadia am I. Be it death, be it history, be it the collective inheritance, be it our collective inheritance of loss, it is indisputable that much haunts all too many sites in the present. But all too often those pasts and those losses do not inscribe their names. They leave no trace. Instead, we come face to face with landscapes and photographs of landscapes as recondite as the epitaph on a grave. And as spectators of these photographs of unmarked landscapes, we become latter-day shepherds, standing before these photographs as they once stood before the tombstone, joined across pictorial history in an attempt to make meaning of their sepulchral surfaces. So perhaps these photographs, Mann's and Gerst's, restore something of the aura of admonishment that once accrued to the exhortation that is the literal meaning of the Mahnmal, the admonishing marker that is the memorial, echoing in these empty photographs the ethical and aesthetic imperatives of the contemporaneous counter-monuments, like Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, in all their resolute minimalist abstraction. Before these photographs that bear witness only to their belated or missed encounter with history and event, before these photographs that take site specificity as their oblique and often irretrievable subject, perhaps it falls to us as spectators to summon our memories, individual and collective. As with the admonishing marker that is the memorial, we bear that responsibility. And all that these we bear that responsibility, and that all that these photographs could or needed to do was point the way. But maybe that's not the way to think about these photographs, for ultimately, what strikes me most is simply the degree to which they have abdicated their evidentiary function, even as they rehearse a set of visual strategies that align them with a documentary imperative. Photographs of atmospheric landscapes that bear not the slightest trace of their atrocious pasts, they depict places that are as easily the site for projected fictions as they are catalysts for historical consciousness. As such, for all their quiet renunciation, they may align more closely with the staged fictions, the dramatic retrospectacles that comprise so much contemporary photographic work than they do with site-specific practices of historical monuments and memorials. Depictions of empty landscapes, these photographs accede to an impoverishment of the photographic image, accepting an evacuation of its referential claims rather than harnessing even the vestigial traces of its evidentiary force. Since Susan Sontag, first in On Photography, last in Regarding the Pain of Others, perhaps no critic has made the case so persuasively and so poignantly for the proof that is the photographic image. That is, until Georges Didi Huberman penned his powerful polemic, Images in Spite of All. As if beginning where Sontag left off in On Plato's Cave, with her arresting account of that moment in her childhood when she first encountered images from the camps and came to understand the wounding power and ethical complexity of photography, Didi Huberman's book turns on 4 photographs from Auschwitz, taken clandestinely by a member of the Sonderkommando and smuggled as negatives from the camp in a tube of toothpaste. Didi Huberman's Images in Spite of All comes to stand not only as an eloquent defense of the evidentiary function of photography, but also as a necessary counter to a language of prohibition in which the depiction of the Holocaust remains for some forever beyond the limits of representation. Broader in its scope, Sontag's last book on photography takes us across a history of war images, returning to the terrain first covered in her early ruminations on the medium to press even further the ethical question of that belated and mediated form of witness that is the photograph. Given the constraints of time, and I am about to conclude, it is to Sontag's discussion of only one set of images that I will turn my attention here, namely those, quote, hitherto unknown pictures of horrors long past, the trove of photographs dating from the 1890s to 1930s depicting Black victims of lynching in small towns across America. For Sontag, as for viewers of the 2000 New York Historical Society exhibition, Without Sanctuary, the pictures were a revelation, not only for the evils of racism they depicted, but for the inhumanity embodied in the very act of taking pictures. As the exhibition revealed, the photographs, some showing a gathered audience grinning at the spectacles of torture, murder, and degradation taking place before them, were taken as souvenirs, some even for a future as postcards. Returning to Sontag here, now, I am struck by how far these sorts of pictures are from the kinds of visual fictions that animate so much of contemporary photography, particularly those that take history as their subject. Though Sontag herself finds in Jeff Wall's defiantly not documentary Monumental Transparency, Dead Troops Talk, a powerfully damning anti-war image, the fictions of such contemporary staged and manipulated photographs generally offer not a site of resistance or remembrance, but a place of refuge, of sanctuary from the world and its realities. And even if it may seem facile and a bit abrupt to turn now as a gesture of conclusion from the historical exhibition Without Sanctuary to Crewdson's contemporary photographic series, Sanctuary, and in turn all the cinematographic photography to which it points, I think it is instructive. For if nothing else, such a stark juxtaposition allows us to contemplate all that distinguishes those instances when the medium served, and indeed still might serve, as a kind of witness, even if only belatedly, to the all too real conditions of historical atrocity, from those instances when history is but one more subject for the unabashedly fictive spectacles that characterize so much of photography in the arena of contemporary art. Thank you.